James Callaway was not a man who took no for an answer. The billionaire real estate mogul built his empire by making bold moves, seizing opportunities where others hesitated. He had turned failing businesses into gold mines, reshaped city skylines, and expanded luxury resorts into places no one had ever dared. His latest venture? A sprawling retreat for the ultra-wealthy, pristine, exclusive, and untouched by the chaos of everyday life. There was only one obstacle: a stubborn little farm sitting right in the heart of his grand vision. And that farm, as insignificant as it seemed, belonged to a woman who had no intention of selling.
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
For James, business was war, and negotiations were his battlefield. He had bought out corporate giants with a single signature, watched men fold under the pressure of his presence, and sealed deals worth billions over a quiet glass of whiskey. A small-town farmer? It should have been an easy win. Yet, when he first laid eyes on the place, something about it unsettled him. It wasn't just land, it was a home. The kind of place built with love, not money. And still, he dismissed the feeling. Sentiment had no place in business. He had a resort to build, and nothing, not nostalgia, not emotions, not even a touching story was going to stand in his way. Lena Whitmore, the owner of the land, wasn't just another name on a contract. She was a force of nature. The woman had fought tooth and nail to keep her family's legacy alive. The Whitmore farm had been passed down for generations, surviving economic downturns, droughts, and even personal tragedies. Selling was out of the question. James, of course, had heard all the excuses before: emotional attachments, tradition, promises to loved ones. But money had a way of making people forget their convictions. And so, with his team of lawyers and land assessors, he moved in, ready to do what he did best: win. But something about Lena's resistance caught him off guard. She didn't argue with lawyers. She didn't scream about corporate greed. Instead, she worked, day in and day out, her hands in the dirt, her boots worn from the fields. She wasn't just holding on to the past. She was fighting for something bigger. And when James saw her standing there, defiant yet unshaken, he felt something unfamiliar: hesitation. This wasn't the kind of battle he was used to. He had expected a simple transaction, not a real story about survival, loyalty, and love. The more he pushed, the more she stood firm. He sent offers, generous, undeniable, life-changing. She rejected them all. He sent advisors to reason with her. She listened, nodded politely, and sent them away. James had built his empire on the belief that everyone had a price. But what if he had finally met someone who didn't? Frustrated but intrigued, James realized brute force wouldn't work. If he wanted to understand why this woman was willing to sacrifice everything, he needed a different approach. And so, he made a decision, one that shocked even him. He would step into her world, see the farm through her eyes. If she wouldn't come to him, then he would go to her. A billionaire disguised as a farm worker. Ridiculous, insane, but suddenly the only plan that made sense. And so, with a name that wasn't his own and hands unaccustomed to hard labor, James Callaway walked onto that farm, completely unaware that what he was about to find would change him forever. Lena Whitmore had never been the kind of woman to back down from a fight. The farm wasn't just her home. It was her family's history, written in the soil, carved into the wooden beams of the old barn, whispered through the rustling of wheat fields in the wind. Every sunrise, she woke up before the world, feeding the animals, tending to the crops, and pushing through exhaustion like it was second nature. Some people lived for luxury, but Lena lived for purpose. And that purpose? Protecting what generations before her had built, no matter how many ruthless businessmen came knocking. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, but she carried it with quiet strength. She had seen what loss could do to a family, how a single bad decision could erase everything in an instant. Her sister, Sophie, was sick, too sick to fight this battle alongside her. So, Lena fought for both of them. The medical bills were piling up, the nights were getting longer, but selling? That was never an option. This land was the last piece of her parents she had left. And James Callaway? He was just another man who didn't understand what it meant to hold on to something that truly mattered. She had dealt with men like him before, men in tailored suits who thought money could solve everything. They came in with their contracts, their empty promises, their numbers that meant nothing to her. This deal will change your life, they said. You'll be free. But Lena didn't want freedom if it meant losing her roots. What James and his kind would never understand was that not everything could be measured in dollar signs. Some things were priceless. Some things were worth more than an empire. But the part that surprised her? He didn't leave. Most men like him would have walked away after the first rejection, after realizing she wouldn't budge. But James lingered, watching, calculating, as if trying to make sense of her refusal. She didn't trust him, not one bit, but there was something different in his eyes, curiosity, maybe even respect. Why was he still here? What did he really want? And then, one day, he stopped being the billionaire standing on the other side of contract. He showed up in the fields, work boots caked in mud, sweat dripping down his brow, asking how to help. It was laughable, really. A man who had spent his life in boardrooms suddenly wanting to play farmer. But something about it unsettled her. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was trying to understand. Lena didn't have time for games. She didn't need an audience or a pity party. But if James Callaway thought he could step into her world and keep his hands clean, he had another thing coming. Because farm life didn't care about status, money, or reputation. Out here, you earned your place the hard way. And if he wanted to see what it meant to truly fight for something, well, he was about to find out. James Callaway had played many roles in his life. Visionary, dealmaker, the man who always got what he wanted. But farmhand? That was new. Standing in the middle of the Whitmore land, dressed in borrowed clothes that smelled of earth and sweat, he barely recognized himself. The calluses forming on his hands were foreign, the burn of physical labor unfamiliar. But the real challenge wasn't the work, it was Lena. She watched him with skepticism, waiting for him to quit, to prove he was just another rich man playing pretend. At first, James saw it as a strategic move. If he could get close enough, understand what made her tick, he could find the right angle, the perfect way to make her change her mind. He had closed impossible deals before, and this was no different. Or so he thought. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to see Lena as just an obstacle. She wasn't stubborn for the sake of it. She wasn't unreasonable. She was fighting for something real, something he had never understood until now. The days blurred together in a rhythm James had never experienced. Early mornings, aching muscles, the quiet satisfaction of work done with his own two hands. He had built empires, but he had never built a fence. He had structured million-dollar acquisitions, but he had never milked a cow. And with each passing day, Lena's world began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a lesson he hadn't realized he needed. Lena, of course, still didn't trust him. She kept her distance, throwing him the hardest tasks, waiting for him to give up. But he didn't. And slowly, something shifted. It wasn't just the farm changing him. It was her. The way she carried her burdens without complaint. The way she laughed despite the weight on her shoulders. He had met powerful people, but Lena's strength wasn't in titles or wealth. It was in resilience, in sacrifice, in the way she protected the one she loved. But the truth had an expiration date. James knew that. Sooner or later, she would find out who he really was. The thought gnawed at him more than he expected. He had come here to break her resolve, to convince her that selling was the right choice. But what if he was the one changing? What if, for the first time in his life, he was starting to question everything he thought he knew? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields in gold and crimson, James realized something that sent a shiver through him. He wasn't just trying to win a deal anymore. He wasn't even sure he wanted the deal at all. The lines between deception and truth were blurring, and the more he tried to stay in control, the more he felt himself slipping. And Lena? She was starting to see him. Not as a businessman, not as a threat, but as someone unexpected. someone who didn't fit into the neat little box she had placed him in. But what would she do when she found out the truth? And more importantly, what would he do when he had to tell her? James had never believed in love. Not the way people talked about it in touching stories or old songs. Love, to him, was just another transaction, a mutually beneficial agreement between two people who understood the terms. But as he spent more time on the farm, something in him began to shift. It wasn't just the simplicity of a life here, the early sunrises, the smell of fresh earth, the quiet satisfaction of an honest day's work. It was Lena, the way she carried herself, unshaken by the world, the way she looked at him as if she saw through every layer he had spent years building. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself it was admiration, respect, maybe even curiosity. But admiration didn't make his pulse race when she walked past. Respect didn't make his chest tighten when he caught her laughing, head thrown back, free in a way he had never been. This was something else, something deeper, something that terrified him. Because James Callaway didn't fall in love. He didn't get attached. He built walls, not homes. But every moment with Lena was tearing those walls apart. Lena, of course, had no idea who he really was. To her, he was just a man learning the ways of the land, someone who had stumbled into this life and stayed. And maybe, for a while, he let himself believe that too. He found himself lingering at the end of the day, stretching out conversations, stealing glances when she wasn't looking. Love had always seemed like a weakness, a distraction, but here, it felt like the only thing that truly mattered. And that realization shook him more than any failed deal ever could. One evening, as they sat by the porch, the sky burning orange and pink, Lena spoke of dreams she had given up, of the things she had wanted before life forced her to fight battles she never asked for. And James listened, not as a businessman, not as a strategist, but as a man who, for the first time, wanted to be something more. He wanted to be part of her world, not just for a season, not just for a fleeting moment, but for real. But the weight of his secret pressed against his chest. How much longer could he pretend? Every word he spoke, every kindness he showed was built on a lie. And yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't care about winning. He didn't care about the deal, the money, the power. All he cared about was the woman sitting beside him, completely unaware that she had already changed him forever. James Callaway, the ruthless businessman, had become a man he didn't recognize. And he wasn't sure if he was terrified of losing himself, or terrified that, for the first time, he was finally becoming the person he was meant to be. Lena had never trusted easily. Life had taught her that promises could be broken, that words meant nothing without actions to back them up. But James? He had made her believe in kindness, in unexpected connections, in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, love could be real. And then, in a single moment, that belief shattered. She had been foolish to let her guard down, to let herself feel something for a man she barely knew. Because the truth had finally come out. James Callaway wasn't just some drifter looking for a fresh start. He was the very man trying to take away everything she had fought to protect. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected. She had let him into her world, had trusted him in ways she never thought she would. And all along, he had been lying. Every shared moment, every stolen glance, every flicker of something real, it had all been part of a game she didn't know she was playing. She had been nothing more than a strategy, a problem he thought he could solve. And that realization burned. James, for the first time in his life, felt truly helpless. He had walked into this expecting to win, expecting to come out on top like he always did. But now, standing in front of Lena, watching the way her hands clenched at her sides, the way her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, he realized something terrifying. He would rather lose everything than lose her. The resort, the money, the deal, it all meant nothing. Not if it cost him the one person who had ever made him question who he was. But words wouldn't fix this. Promises wouldn't fix this. He had spent his life building an empire, but now he needed to prove that Lena meant more to him than a contract. And the only way to do that was to let it all go. To walk away from the deal, from the billions, from everything he had built. To choose her, not as part of a negotiation, but because she was the only thing that truly mattered. And so, James did something no one ever expected. He walked into his own boardroom and burned the deal to the ground. He called off the acquisition, withdrew every offer, and made sure Lena's farm would remain untouched. And then, he did something even bigger. He used his power, his resources, everything he had to ensure Sophie got the medical care she needed. Because love wasn't about grand gestures or empty words. Love was about showing up, even when you had nothing left to gain. But was it enough? Could Lena ever forgive him? He had built his life on power, but standing outside her home, waiting for her to answer the door, James had never felt so small. Because this time, he wasn't here to make a deal. He was here to fight for the only thing he had ever truly wanted.